Okay. Welcome, everybody. Delighted to see you. My name is David Myers. I teach history here in the history department, and I'm delighted to welcome to this table Professor Shaul Magid, who is a well-known scholar and thinker and public intellectual in the United States and beyond. Shaul is a professor of modern Jewish studies in residence at the Harvard Divinity School, and the author of 9 books, ranging in theme from early modern Kabbalah and Hasidism to the U.S.-Israeli political activist Meir Kahane. And I think it's important to note the most recent book before the one that we're going to be talking about and whose launch we're going to be marking and celebrating today. And that is Shaul's book that has gotten a great deal of public attention called The Necessity of Exile, which in some sense brings him into some measure of alignment with the subject of this book, Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. Shaul has undertaken a kind of heroic labor in translating a number of the most tricky texts, I would say, written in 20th century Jewish and particularly rabbinic literature. These are translations drawn from Rabbi Teitelbaum's 2 major works that lay out his anti-Zionist theological worldview, called Vayoel Moshe and Ha-Geulah and Ha-Temurah. So one of the things that we're here to mark is Shaul's translation of portions of these 2 texts in this book called Jewish Anti-Zionism as Political Theology, which is part of the University of California Press Luminos series in Jewish history and cultures. You can see some of the other titles on the back table over there and get a sense of the range of interest reflected in that series. I'm delighted to announce that Shaul has a companion volume that is coming out in the fall that is a series of his essays on Rabbi Yoel Teitelbaum. Oh, great. I'm delighted we've not even introduced the respondents yet. Rabbi Teitelbaum is important to us because he is really arguably the most significant Jewish anti-Zionist thinker of the 20th century. Amongst other things, he's also the founder of the Satmar Hasidic dynasty. But for our purposes, what's most relevant is his extremely well-articulated position of anti-Zionism that became a kind of anchor of Haredi or ultra-Orthodox anti-Zionist attitudes. I think this is not just important in and of itself in filling a major hole in the English language about an important chapter that's often forgotten, which is to say a chapter in Jewish history devoted to Jewish anti-Zionism, but is especially timely because we live in an age when there has been renewed attention and indeed controversy over anti-Zionism, and particularly over the connections of anti-Zionism to anti-Semitism. I don't think I need to go into any great detail for people to understand what I'm speaking about. One of the things that's important to consider in that conversation, that contemporary conversation, is that Jewish anti-Zionism has a long and rather diverse history. There's a range of Jewish thinkers, secular and religious, who define themselves as anti-Zionist for a variety of reasons, and one would be hard-pressed to characterize them as anti-Semites. So it's interesting and important, I think, to add that historical dimension to our contemporary conversation. We're really thrilled to be one of the first sites of the launch of this book, and we're also thrilled that we're going to have not just some opening remarks by Shaul that will frame the book, but a series of responses by 2 esteemed colleagues. To my immediate right, Professor Leah Hochman, who teaches Jewish thought at Hebrew Union College in Los Angeles, and Professor Joshua Shaines, who is the new holder of the Emanuel Ringelblum Chair in Jewish Studies at the University of California, at Davis, and is making his inaugural debut as a fellow UC faculty member, having been here before on many occasions. So the order of the day is Shaul will open with some remarks. We'll hear some responses from Josh and Leah. I'll add some remarks, and we'll have a little conversation amongst ourselves, and then we'll open up for conversation with you, the audience. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Shaul Magid.
Thank you. Thank you, David, for the invitation. Thank you all for coming. The companion volume, the monograph, Margot brought a copy of the proofs that are on the desk. So if you want to see afterwards the second. What's that?
What you really mean is see and pre-order.
See and pre-order, exactly. See and pre-order. They're also both available open access.
Oh, I forgot. Hold on. But here is our new colleague, Margot Irvin, who is our point of connection with UC Press, and who has enabled us to continue to expand the series, which is a series that has one important mark of distinction, which is all books in the series are open access.
Yeah. Okay. So I wrote something brief that I want to read because I felt like I did want to say a few things, and I wanted to take this occasion to be able to articulate some of what went into the process, the decision, and why I think the book is relevant. So why did I write this book and that book that's on the table? Asking such a question of a scholar is always intriguing and only sometimes illuminating. Why choose any scholarly topic aside from personal interest? But the choices of many scholars often extend beyond that interest, intent, or objectives. Why this and why now is always a question worth asking. Why a translation of a monograph on Yoel Teitelbaum of Satmar when it appears his entire theological project is on the losing end of history? Should the scholar be involved in the business of resurrection, or should they simply let the dead lie in peace? Or, as Morris Steinschneider famously said, give the tradition a proper burial. This book and the other one is my answer to that question. I became familiar with Teitelbaum's writing in the 1980s when I lived as a Haredi Jew in Jerusalem. I found them rhetorically challenging and substantively fascinating. They served as the unspoken ideational template in the Haredi world that I inhabited. In the Haredi world, by the way, Teitelbaum's position is known as the Shita, right? Just simply as the position, right? Without any explanation. When I left the Haredi world for the Hebrew University, my interest in the sociality of that world waned, but my deep investment and fascination of the ideas that founded it never did. Other things came across my path, demanded my attention, and I thus set his writings aside for many years. But his volumes stared at me seductively from my bookshelves, and I knew that someday I would return. The why of this project, that is, why now, is in part because, as David said, in a way, I felt there was a deep misunderstanding of Teitelbaum's political theological project precisely when understanding it, even if one disagreed with it, began to matter in ways that I could not have imagined 30 years ago. So I returned to Teitelbaum's writings after finishing a book which consisted of translations and commentary on an obscure Lithuanian rabbi named Elijah Soloveitchik, who wrote a Hebrew translation to the Gospels. When I dove back into the world of Teitelbaum, what Teitelbaum created, I was stunned to see how he was able to articulate it in our time, and also something that exceeded his own time, a time when the Zionist consensus began to teeter in response to the events he sort of predicted, but could not have quite imagined. Teitelbaum is one of those figures who everybody knows what he thinks, and almost nobody has read what he wrote. He has thus become a kind of caricature of what Zizek calls lost causes. And even those who do read him see him as a lost cause. In some ways, they're right, and yet following Zizek, sometimes lost causes are less lost than they appear. I once gave a seminar on Vayoel Moshe at Columbia University, and one of the people attending the seminar who was an Orthodox rabbi who studied in Gush Etzion, which is a yeshiva in Sedom in the West Bank in Israel, said to me that in the late afternoons, he said to me, we would sometimes read Vayoel Moshe together in the yeshiva, and we would laugh. What was funny was not the text. I can assure you there was nothing funny. But what was funny was the lost cause nature of it. The laughter of a victor as they review the writings of the defeated. And as they laughed in the Beit Midrash, nestled in the West Bank, it was actually kind of funny, until it wasn't. As David mentioned, I wrote a book on Meir Kahana and Elijah Soloveitchik and now Teitelbaum, so in some way, a trilogy of lost causes. Although not my intent, I guess I am a scholar of lost causes. Not a bad inscription for my tombstone. But as we can see with Kahana, sometimes lost causes come back to haunt us. But Teitelbaum is different than Kahana in that he laboriously made his case through a deep and extraordinarily erudite analysis of the tradition. If Kahana gave us a radical politics, Teitelbaum gave us a political theology. I learned from my book on Soloveitchik that the best way to truly enter a textual world not your own is through the act of translation. Translation is not reading. Rather, it enables one to break into the mind of an author, to struggle with them, to understand the process more than the product. Walter Benjamin, whose essay, The Task of the Translator, is always close at hand for me. He uses two phrases to describe translation: echo and harmony. A translation, as Gershom Scholem argued, does not replicate the original nor diminish it, against Bialik's famous saying that translation is like kissing through a veil. Translation for Scholem had the potential to open up the original to dimensions the original does not and cannot reveal. We should remember that Scholem wrote his dissertation by translating Sefer Bahir in Germany. That is, translation can be an esoteric as well as an aesthetic exercise. And here Benjamin's observations apply. An echo distorts sound as it refracts, as refracted from elsewhere, and yet the distortion of the sound can produce something that the original cannot. An emotion, a sense of grandeur in the distortion of sound, as anybody that's heard an echo can attest. Harmony is the layering of an alternative musical register, and really an alternative tonal register, on a melody that makes the melody richer, more subtle, and even more beautiful, and sometimes more dissonant. Compare, for example, or think of John Coltrane's dissonant harmonics and improvisation in his Love Supreme. As opposed to an echo, harmony doesn't touch the melody, but it stretches it outward, beyond its limitations, sometimes taking you to a foreign soundscape, only to return you exhausted and inspired back to the melody now reimagined. The challenges of translating Teitelbaum are different than, say, translating poetry, and here I learned a lot from a long conversation I had a few weeks ago with Peter Cole in a restaurant in Cambridge about his recent translations of Bialik. But I was not translating a poem. That has its own specific challenges. I was translating a sefer. Vayoel Moshe and Ha-Geulah are not books, they're sfarim. And what's the difference between a book as we know it and a sefer? A non-fictional scholarly book has a reader in mind. It speaks to an audience. It explains itself, or at least it should. It contributes to an ongoing conversation. It could be terse, but it's meant to be read, page after laborious page. A sefer is often self-referential. It doesn't reveal its sources. It doesn't speak about its method. It moves from subject to subject without editing. It doesn't make what we scholars call an argument, but it presents us with disparate observations, rays of illumined thought, often through allusion. It's not meant to be read, it's meant to be studied. It is the object of the Jewish religious practice of learning. My task was to see if I can translate a sefer into a book that remained a sefer. not only one accessible to those trained in the language and culture of learning, and I really owe this to something that Josh had said to me last week in talking about his reading of the book. Could I render into English the contours and presentation of Teitelbaum's arguments refracted through myriad sources, tangents, interludes, into a religious text that could be studied as opposed to read? That is, could I reproduce a sefer? That is the task I set for myself. Any translation of a sefer must illuminate the argument buried therein, or it would be unreadable. This required making choices. As I often tell students, managing simtsum is the art of making a good writer a great writer. When Truman Capote was asked what he thought of Jack Kerouac's On the Road, he allegedly said, "There is writing and there is typing. That is typing." Texts such as Vayoel Moshe needn't be translated in their entirety to make the important argument they seek to make, which is why I did it in selections. This is because the non-editorial nature of any similar text makes superfluidity and repetitions unavoidable and maddening, unless one thinks the words themselves in their entirety are Holy Writ. Thus, after a careful study of the text in its entirety, I had to choose the sections and chapters I felt best expressed the theological, political, allocating the cross-references and more detailed references not stated in the text of footnotes and annotations. While doing that, I had to try to keep open, sometimes pry open, the exegetical implications and arguments, the exhaustive breadth and depth of the tradition that Teitelbaum deployed to develop his thesis. I found myself sitting with him in virtual chavrusa, contesting a point, arguing about his reading of a midrash. It was recorded that by some of his students that at the time that much of Vayoel Moshe was written without a library. That is, many of the sources were cited by heart, and thus I had to make small corrections and annotations, but it is still quite remarkable how much the tradition seemed to be embedded in that person's mind. Much of Ha-Geulah, which is the second book that he writes after the Six-Day War in 1967, consists of transcriptions of oral discourses collected by his students. I came to realize two things. First, Teitelbaum needed to be translated to offer an alternative to the superficial rendering of his position as a lost cause. And second, that a separate volume needed to be written that could expand the argument by putting it in conversation with many others he never heard of, or to better understand what I call in the introduction to the monograph, Teitelbaum's Straussian political theological problem. How does one categorize Teitelbaum's political theological writings? It's often thought, mistakenly in my view, that Vayoel Moshe and Ha-Geulah are Hasidic texts because they're written by a Hasidic master. But not all texts written by Hasidic masters are Hasidic texts. They are, as I read them, a combination, these texts of his, a combination of political theology, theopolitics, I'll talk about that distinction, and heresiology, that is, the study of heresy. They're deep interventions into the Jewish political landscape of Zionism, the great political project of Jewish modernity, from a theological perspective, often expressed through the lens of halachic discourse. In addition, as important, both are works of heresiology. So heresiology is a much more common literary genre in Christianity than in Judaism, in its attempt to draw boundaries between legitimate forms of belief and those that exist outside the orbit of normative tradition. Teitelbaum's texts are studies in modern-day heresy, a kind of Jewish heresiology, and its implications for his covenantal theology at a time he believed was one on the cusp of the end time. So I argue in both of these books that Teitelbaum was no less a messianist than Rav Kook. And he begins his introduction to Vayoel Moshe by talking about the Holocaust, the debate of looking for its causes, and the onset of the end time, what he calls Ikvada de Mashiach. Political theology was a term coined by German theorist Carl Schmitt. One of Schmitt's basic claims in his discussion of sovereignty is that secular politics is for the most part an extension of subterranean theological claims. This, of course, has no relevance to Teitelbaum, who had no interest in secular politics and rejected any notion of Jewish politics. But his project does loosely cohere with Schmitt's definition of political theology in two ways. Number one, that politics is always about a friend-enemy dichotomy. For Teitelbaum, the true messianic or the false messianic. And two, that politics promotes a kind of decisionism, whereby the enemy must be rejected in total and the sovereign has overriding power, in Teitelbaum's case, through divine mandate as the Messiah. Thus, for Teitelbaum, the only legitimate politics is a messianic politics, where the Messiah becomes the sovereign, acting according to divine mandate in the tradition. Any other Jewish politics is false messianism and heretical, and should be given no sanction. Here, I think Martin Buber can help us, because Buber coined the term theopolitics as a response to Schmitt's political theology. For Buber, theopolitics is an attempt to undo reigning messianic political forms of Zionism, sometimes even deeming them idolatrous, and that arguing that in the Jewish political tradition, certainly the true messianic one, the only sovereign is God. The Messiah is simply the vehicle of divine will. So Buber Zionism is thus not messianic. In fact, it is a protest against messianic politics, but Zionist nonetheless. Different than Teitelbaum, but perhaps not categorically so, Buber sees Zionism's messianism as dangerous, a dangerous form of sovereignty that can have disastrous ends. And here one could also think of Israeli philosopher Yeshayahu Leibovich, who similarly claimed any messianic claim in relation to Zionism. In fact, any religious claim in relation to Zionism was anathema, even idolatry. Neither Buber nor Leibovich would concede to Teitelbaum's zero-sum game when it came to Zionism, but each in different ways pointed to a crack in the facade of Zionism that for Teitelbaum became its very mark of heresy. But Teitelbaum had a different solution to the problem than both Buber and Leibovich faced, because he refused to accept the legitimacy of the division of religion and politics. That is, Teitelbaum refused secularization that both Buber and Leibovich, for different reasons, accepted. Teitelbaum used to see Jewish sovereignty in the land Teitelbaum refused to see sovereignty in the land as simply a custodian in exile. Even in the face of significant challenges to the Jews that Teitelbaum experienced personally, Jews remained committed to the exilic frame of Jewish history, not simply as circumstantial, not even as covenantal, but existential. All attempts to end exile theologically or politically before the Messiah was an open rejection of the divine covenant. Thus, for Teitelbaum, Zionism, and this is the interesting twist, for Teitelbaum, Zionism was the quintessence of anti-Messianism. Therefore, he rejects any notion of a Jewish politics that's not a messianic politics. And here I think him and Reb Kook would agree. And for him, messianic politics must cohere with the original Israeli notion of only God as sovereign. And here he and Kook would not agree. The Messiah is anointed by God through prophecy, closing the circle of Jewish exile and undoing earlier forms of Israelite kingship politics. While Buber can therefore be a Zionist through non-messianic politics and still maintain Jewish exile, Teitelbaum and Kook was unable to or unwilling to accept any Jewish state politics that was not messianic. And the activism of messianism within a divinely ordained King Messiah was for Teitelbaum heretical. Kook maintained that redemption itself can become manifest without a Messiah first appearing, and even though an outwardly secular project. Therefore, Kook, in his 1904 eulogy for Herzl, talks about the Messiah, son of Joseph, which is crucial to Kook's worldview. There is no Zionism without the Messiah, son of Joseph, for Kook. Without the Messiah, son of Joseph, Kook would have rejected Zionism. Teitelbaum rejected that possibility. For him, messianic politics that ensues before the coming of the Messiah is false and destructive by definition. So heresiology, the study of heresy, in the Christian tradition is a genre of literature that defines what we might call anachronistically orthodoxy. Teitelbaum lived in a world not dominated by the modern fracture fracturing of heretical claims. He attempted to revive the notion of heresy as a constitutive component of traditional legitimacy and view Zionism as its most egregious expression, in part because it claims to erase or end exile while claiming to fulfill it, and in doing so, it undermines the messianic idea central to Judaism. For Teitelbaum, religious Zionism is guilty of forcing the end, attempting to bring about redemption before its time, and secular Zionism, which largely abandons the return of the Jews to the land as premised on messianism, essentially erases the messianic idea altogether. He articulates this in his reading of Bar Kochba and Shabtai Tzvi in Vayoel Moshe, two exemplars of Jewish heresy. Secular Zionists embodying Bar Kochba, and religious Zionism, Sabbateanism. For Teitelbaum, to claim heresy is no longer optional. To claim heresy is no longer optional is to undermine the semblance of the Jewish tradition. In short, without heresy, the remnant of orthodoxy collapses. Yet living on the precipice of the end time, heresy is precisely that which will emerge as a test for the Jews to resist the messianic arrival. So in other words, what I'm saying is that Cook and Teitelbaum both agree that they're living in the end time. They both agree that Zionism is central to that end time. Cook believes it has to be embraced. Teitelbaum believes it has to be resisted. Along these lines, Teitelbaum's political theological works are works of heresiology. They're describing, defining, polemicizing against what he determined is the pre-messianic heresy of Zionism, the quintessence of the anti-messianic. He deploys thousands of sources and a large tapestry of the tradition to make that claim. So I'm often challenged in this kind of work by those who ask if I believe Teitelbaum's claims. And if not, why write about him? I did an interview with Zev Brenner. For those of you who know, he's does this kind of Haredi live radio show in New York that starts at midnight on Saturday night. I mean, who's listening?
Only 9 o'clock in California.
Right. Who's listening to the radio in Brooklyn at midnight on a Saturday? That you get from the call-ins. Right. Anyway, so this actually came up a lot. If you don't believe in Teitelbaum's claims, then why write about him? It's a curious question for someone like me and many other scholars who often write about people we don't agree with. As a scholar of Jewish modernity, I think these figures I don't agree with make important interventions as a way to understand Jewish modernity more generally, or this moment in particular. In this sense, writing a book on Meir Kahana and then on Teitelbaum actually makes sense. I don't agree with either, but there are aspects of each that I find compelling, surprisingly relevant, and even important for us to confront and understand. Like Shalom felt about Sabbateanism, for those of you that know, without Sabbateanism, and here without a fuller understanding of what underlies the Orthodox theological opposition to Zionism, we're missing something crucial in understanding our time. I remain convinced that Teitelbaum has a real political theology buried deep underneath and within his wide-ranging and dizzying exegesis of the tradition, and I hope to have uncovered and explicated at least in part. If I've succeeded, even as he may not recognize it or may not agree with it, I can say Dayenu. Thank you for your patience.
No, Josh.
Either way is fine. You want me to go? You sure?
100%.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Thank you for inviting me to speak, and thank you, Margot, for the early edition of the book, which, as you can see, I dove into. And as Shaul said, as I told him last week, sorry.
This is what's called the Shita.
Yeah, that's the Shita. Yeah.
That's the Shita.
So the reason it looks like this, by the way, is because every Shabbos afternoon I read a book, especially in the summertime when it's longer. And I thought, okay, I can't write because I don't write on Shabbat, so I use these little sticky notes. And so that's why this looks this way. And I was going to read it that first Shabbos it came, and that was impossible because it can't be read, right? It has to be learned. It's a sefer, not a book. I'll read the next book. That one I can maybe knock off in an afternoon. But this one very much not. I'm reminded, when I was first learning how to learn 35 years ago in a Baal Tshuva yeshiva, we were learning something or another. And all of us were very interested in becoming religious and we wanted to do everything just right. And we learned some halacha or another that was in the Gemara. And, oh, wait, is that how you do that? And the teacher just looked at us like we were crazy and said, what do you, this has nothing to do with how we live our lives. That's not the question we ask, right? We're learning Gemara, we're learning Talmud. First of all, Lishma, right, for its own sake, because it's a commandment to do so. We're learning it because all the opinions are Torah, and these minority opinions that maybe not become the halacha and the ma'aseh, as you say, the opinion that might not become what we do, is nevertheless important. It might become relevant down the line. And above all, it's about shaping our thinking, right? We learn this to shape the way we think, right? It's about, as many of us tell our students, it's about the journey, not the final destination. So, for example, in the Talmudic discussion of despair over lost objects, there's a mechanism by which finders keepers, losers weepers. How does that work? So the way it works is the person who loses despairs of the product, the person who finds it, therefore, is allowed to keep it. What if the person doesn't realize they've lost the product? Can you keep it? And then there's a long discussion where two people disagree about whether unrealized despair, the person doesn't yet know they lost it, can the person keep it or not? And there's a very long conversation where they debate it, and finally at the end you find out the answer, which, to highlight how irrelevant the answer is, I don't actually remember the answer. I think unrealized despair is despair, they finally decide. But the point is, it's not about the halacha at the end, it's about the journey. And I thought about the ignorance of our question and our surprise and shock and need to engage on practicalities. When I posted on Facebook about this event, and many people responded, as Facebook works.
As is the Shita.
As is the Shita. First,
Josh and Shaul are two of the more active.
Yeah.
Facebook,
So first was, he's just anti-Zionist, but he got out in the Kastner train, and he left everyone else to die, so why do we even bother with him? Like, he's a traitor to the Jewish people. And then another, even more artistic sort of ignorant sort of person said, well, this meme disproves anti-Zionism, so why bother with this?
This meme produced by AI.
This meme produced by AI, most likely, disproves the whole thing. And I wonder why such, knee-jerk hostility, and I think the issue is that many, all modern forms of Jewishness are sort of constructions that we'd like to believe are self-evident, but aren't, right? I mean, professors can all show how they're constructs, but rabbis and individuals don't want them to be constructs because you want to believe in whatever lifestyle you're living. And I think seeing something that challenges that, even if it's not convincing on its own, but just that challenges your own, what you assume to be self-evident, which in this case would be the Zionist project, I think is very, very difficult. But that takes me to what the book is, the Sefer, is actually accomplishing. To say that there is deep learnedness in what Rabbi Yoel wrote is impossible to exaggerate. The level of sources that he is able to draw from memory is incredible. It's absolutely incredible. And the range of topics that he brings. And there's if you read the book, you'll see there's two major discourses. The first one is more halachic. It's more a legal conversation. For example, there's an opinion that says there's a commandment to move to the land of Israel, or maybe to live there, which is two different things. And so he says, all right, let's dig in, man. Let's look into this thing, this so-called mitzvah, the so-called commandment to go move to Israel, to the land of Israel. And then there's the second piece, Ha-Geulah, Ha-Temurah, which is Agada, which is the other part of Judaism, the theology, everything that's not legal, basically, everything that's extra legal. But we all know these are deeply interconnected, and the kinds of themes that are coming out just by learning through it are not limited, I found, one to the other. The nature of evil itself. How does evil function in the world? Which is a deep conversation in Judaism. And it's not a Hasidic text, because the perspective he has is not a typically Hasidic, this idea, the way he sees evil separate from divinity is not necessarily common among other Kabbalists, for sure, in any event. Ideas like the demonic miracle, which is something, frankly, I hadn't really explored. But thinking about that, right, and through the book of Job, that Satan has the ability to perform miracles, and they have a purpose, and you have to think about that. Just because a miracle happens doesn't mean that God is behind it. And that's worth thinking about. The theology of the Holocaust, that truly has to be grappled with, as difficult as it may be. The idea that he brings out, essentially, that because the Jews violated the three oaths, which is the oath not to basically to all at once go back to the land and create some sort of a state there, that exempted the parallel obligation of non-Jews not to oppress the Jews too much. And if we violated our oath, then the non-Jews are exempt from their oath. And therefore, there's a clear correlation between the Zionist project and the Holocaust happening. And actually, it's not even just theological. And this I didn't know until I read this. He brings political insights to it. He really talks about the relationship of Zionism to anti-Semitism, the way Zionism leans into anti-Semitism for its own purposes, and that had a sort of earthly kind of analysis, which I had not seen before. And then finally, one last thing before I come to I don't know how much time I have. A few minutes? 2 minutes more? A couple minutes. Ha-Geulah Ha-Temurah means on the redemption and on the switching out. It's basically about the sin of the golden calf, and the idea that Jews thought they were doing something holy, but it was, of course, the quintessentially opposite practice. And what it speaks to is, who is he in conversation with? He has no interest in anyone who posts on my Facebook wall, I can guarantee you that. And he has no interest with Zionists, right? He's interested, as every sort of ideologue of modernity is, with the people who are closest to him. I mean, the Zionists are already beyond the pale. But there are people from his own camp. He's interested in the Ha-Geulah and explaining why the Ha-Geulah is so wrong-headed. He's interested in people from his own camp who are by 67, 70s, who are already interested in the Zionist project in ways that he thought was very discomforting. He wants to work on them, the people closest to him who are missing it. They're the ones who are making the switch to idolatry. When you read Teitelbaum, all of us are choosing a la carte. Everyone in this room, I guarantee it, I'll make a wager, is choosing their worldview a la carte, right? You go to Leibovich, and he's so wonderful because he says Zionism is nationalism, is idolatry, and it's going to lead us to do all these terrible crimes and get out of the West Bank, and liberals love that. He also hated pluralism and thought Reform Judaism was terrible and should be crushed, right? You have to take him a la carte if you're a modern pluralistic person. And certainly that's true with Teitelbaum. The essay on Hebrew is very clear what he thinks about girls' education. Might not be as popular as some of the other parts. But I don't think that really matters, because it's the training in how to think. It's the training in seeing, in thinking in a Torah way that I think is what it brings. And I'll just end with one comment. There's an old line that all scholarship is autobiographical. And in light of, I don't mean to embarrass you, but in light of the output you have, you didn't even mention the Substacks. You had a long life, clearly. Yeah, if all scholarship is autobiographical. But I would say that doesn't mean that you're, as you mentioned, that doesn't mean you're a Satmar Chassid or that you're a Kahanist. And by the way, I'm not even sure it means your story is one of lost causes. I think it's really more about future possibilities. I think that if all scholarship is autobiographical, then this is a biography of a person who's living through Torah and thinking about future possibilities. And with a text like this, for those of us who either don't have the erudition or don't have the time to look up every source, it allows more of us to do the same thing. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I want to apologize first for coming late. I finished at the other campus across town at 3. I cut their exam time by 5 minutes, much to their,
Chagrin.
I wouldn't say chagrin as much as rage. So I just barely, and I
Thank you for being with
I
us.
appreciate that we were just a couple minutes late. And I have gratitude for the open access. I didn't ask for the book. I read mine on as PDF, and I'm just happy that this is available. And I want to just say that when David initially asked me to be on the panel, I was like, what is going on with this project? Why would you have Shaul do this? This is like the stupidest thing. And I may not have said that part out loud, but I just very grateful. David said to me, with all seriousness, that this is one of the most important texts of the time period. And I was skeptical, and I just really appreciate you forcing, pushing, encouraging the read of it, because I think it is actually one of the most important books, one of the most important texts, I think. And I will just say again, this is not really prefatory remark, but the translation itself is masterful. There is this skill that you have, Shaul, and I've seen it in other works that you've translated, similar to these topics, that holds the English reader in tension or in conversation with the yeshiva bucher, the person who's learning, and that those two people can be in tandem. They're not often the same person. That one understands the text and the sort of the analog version of the hypertext, that the way that the translation is using the Hebrew terms, maintaining the Hebrew terms or the Yiddish terms, or the textual references themselves, while also giving us a whole level of discourse that what that means, what each one means. And keeping the Hebrew allows for the multi-generational conversation that is being referenced, while also pushing the reader to understand what's going on. And the footnotes are a masterclass in the footnote. I'm a big fan of a footnote, as some people in the room know. And I just really, there's something that it's the holding of the Hebrew phrases that I think that are really keep the rabbinic textness of the text while still rendering it in English. There is also, I think, in doing that, a displacement of historicity. And as with all great rabbinic texts, that there's not a sense of chronology, that we're writing in this time for these people only now. But it manages to forget the historical context in which the work was written while also maintaining the historical context. And that's an excruciating needle to thread. And I'm really grateful for you for your own erudition in order to sort of do that that works so masterfully. My take on what Teitelbaum is saying is that he's actually playing the long game. And in playing the long game, what I mean is that in this case, the historicity of his moment is in effect irrelevant. So although you place this, he's writing this in the sort of the last vestiges right after 67, that the whole Zionist project is succeeding, the glory of 67, the glory of that victory, and everyone is moved toward the Zionism camp, is actually his insistence that this modern politics is momentary, and indeed it has nothing on the longevity of the plan as affected by God. And I think it's one of the key takeaways of the entire piece. For political Zionism, or cultural Zionism, or religious or theological, any form of Zionism that you want to name, for any Zionist or anyone to think of Zionism, that it would be able to pull a fast one on God, who orchestrated the entire Exodus, seems to be a truly wonderful halachic judgment of hubris of the highest order. Now, this is the God that affected the entire Exodus narrative. 400 years of slavery started with Joseph and then ends with Moses. That this momentary experience of a political movement might be successful for Teitelbaum is so ridiculous a thought that the halachic questions that he's encountering are just proof texts for the larger tshuva that he's offering. And the framing of his introduction gives this objective away, because he sets the Holocaust into a gallery of other theological rather than historical mistakes of the people of Israel. Right? He mentions the golden calf. He mentions the idolatry more than once that caused the rabbinic reason for the destruction of the first temple is idolatry. He pushes that all the way back, not to the modern age and not even to the medieval age, but to the biblical era. That is, we are a people who make mistakes. And isn't this just another one of God's punishments for the hubris, the mistaken identity, that choices that we continue to make, that even the Israelites in the desert made? So we're in a long line of mistake makers, and God has had our number from the get-go. And Teitelbaum knows this. I think that is his argument in the larger framing. In other words, for Teitelbaum, it's God's movie, and we are bit players on the Cinemaplex. And this notion of Zionism as idolatry, this is, for me, one of the most incredible reads. I have long taught that Zionism is a rejection of Messianism, so I cannot tell you my shock that I was right there with the Satmar, that we were on the same page. Not that, of course, I come to a very different conclusion, but I think that what the goal of Zionism is the rejection of the original goal of Zionism is the rejection of Messianism. And Teitelbaum sees that with such crystal clarity that it's both completely predictable to my mind, but also shocking. And in bringing the golden calf story forward, the way that he frames the entire diatribe against Zionism, he reminds us that the golden calf scene is horrible. It's destructive. It's full of anguish and disgust and divine retribution. It's full of destruction. It's a rooting out of the wrong-headedness from a people who are days away from 400 years of oppression and persecution and a distance from God. So there's something really deeply unfair about the Exodus narrative, and I will just also confess that the class that I just left is a whole class on Moses, so I'm like deeply rooted in the Exodus story right now. But in some ways what Zionism offered, certainly in the 20th century, but in its origin in the late 19th century, is a panacea to both an oppression and a persecution of evil taskmasters who enslaved by conscription and forced poverty and tripled the workload while also reducing the necessary materials for growth. And the righteous indignation of Teitelbaum mirrors Moses' righteous indignation. We have freed you from slavery, and for Teitelbaum it is, you are still in Galut. Moses is mad. He's angry, and I feel like that's what Teitelbaum is, the restrained rage of people who cannot stop making the same mistake. And I just really appreciate you bringing that up.
Thank you.
One of my favorite Nicomachean ethics from Aristotle is righteous indignation. I feel like that's undersold. We should talk about that more. Okay, so two more very quick notes. One is that a beautiful part of this text is his insistence on theocracy. I think, Josh, you mentioned this, and Shaul, you also brought it out, that there is a sense of, in some ways, a negative imprint of Spinoza there. Spinoza really wants religion shouldn't continue because the theocracy ended. And Teitelbaum is like, no, the theocracy is still happening, so you have no business thinking about politics. And I think that those two, it would be lovely to have had an opportunity to put them in conversation. I don't want to write that paper, but I think someone should. I'm going to welcome David to do that. I have lots. I could say more about the heresy. The last point, I don't want to go too long, is that Teitelbaum just really meditates on tochacha, which is the halachic obligation to rebuke the wrongdoer. And that deployment of tochacha, that obligation, which he deploys against Zionism, and I want to think of the way that he thinks about Zionism is the widest possible definition of anybody who's complicit in anything having to do with the state. And that includes the agudas. Yeah, right. I'm just trying to get the pronunciation right. I'm like a fourth generation West Coast Jew. I'm not going to be able to get it. Agudas Israel. That anybody who has anything to do with the state is in that frame, right? And the meditation or the dwelling on this requires the identification of the transgression itself. And for Teitelbaum, the sheer heresy of a political aspiration that's outside the purview of God's plan, which we cannot know. And every single one of his references reminds us that nobody has known it. And anybody who pretends to is part of this. It's not, the sin is, or the transgression is not just the political aspiration for a Jewish nation state, but kal v'chomer, even more so, it's the idolatry, the self-aggrandizement, the halachic hypocrisy, the moral turpitude, and the stiff-necked refusal to learn that what God taught, even from the inception of the covenant itself. And he is in a long line of people calling out behavior that he understands as Chilul Hashem, like the desecration of God's name, rather than Kiddush Hashem. He dates that back to Ezekiel, but also, obviously, it goes back to the covenant at Sinai. And the necessity of rebuke, the manner of this rebuke, provides sort of a hermeneutic of obligation, or really an example of the integrity of Teitelbaum's position. Such is the nature of the covenant at Sinai, and such is the rabbinic affirmation of that covenant, that we, the reader here, are beholden to uphold all of the mitzvot, including the mitzvah to rebuke the transgressor. And that, I think, is a brilliant read on why he thinks that Zionism is the mistaken path. We have built a new temple. It's a political temple. And the destruction of that temple is the requirement of the divine age, anybody who's a divine agent, anyone who understands themselves as part of the divine task. So, this is what I meant by Teitelbaum's long game. It's not over, really, until the Messiah comes. And in essence, he exposes the existential crisis at hand, that Zionism's existence prevents God from redeeming Israel. So we can only end it with the Messiah, but we cannot have the Messiah as long as there is Zionism. And even more so, for Teitelbaum, silence is complicity. So any tree you ever planted, any hatikva you ever sang, any blue and white you ever showed up or ate of a cupcake, that is complicity. And that is the tochacha that he is offering us in this book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah, Josh. I actually had no idea what I would offer by way of response to Shaul, but your comments have been so generative that I'm afraid to say I have something to say. Everything has been said, but not by everyone. And in fact, I have three main points that I'd like to make, which are preceded by four preliminary observations. But they're quick. So the first is just to highlight what Josh and Leah said, which is to say that the degree of difficulty in translating this text was about as high as one can imagine. And Shaul, you really have pulled off an extraordinary feat of translation. The challenge in particular reminds me of the famous expression that was said to encapsulate the Jewish experience in the 20th century for many people. It's the famous line attributed to Simon, and before him Gutman, and after him Halivni, which is the tragedy of my life, is that the people I daven or pray with, I can't talk to, and the people I talk to, I can't daven with.
Right.
That's what it must have been like for you to undertake this translation, because there are some people with whom you could talk about some, linguistic technicalities, but they wouldn't be alive to the larger theopolitical consequences. And there's some people who fall into the latter category who would be completely inattentive to the sort of linguistic or specifically Satmar or Teitelbaum-esque connotations. So really extremely impressive work of translation. About this or not being a Hasidic sefer, I would say that more generally, it's highly dubious whether Satmar should be deemed a Hasidic movement in general. And that's kind of a topic we could take up on another occasion. Two other very small points. One, I was really struck by, this question of audience by, it reminds one of Maimonides' opening to the guide, where he sort of narrows the circle of possible readers to like one, right? He says, I'm really writing for sympathetic readers, right? He says, excluding, how should we say, everybody in the world, right? By thinking of who might be the sympathetic reader, like his narrow circle of followers. But it's a very interesting play to, in some sense, his own just kind of surprising epistemological modesty, which I'll get back to at the end. The fourth thing that kind of flies in the face of what we read in the end of Vayoel Moshe, and this is an important point, the friction between action and articulated thought is important, where he kind of polemicizes against girls' education. He did establish a girls' educational network almost immediately after establishing a boys' network. The Beis Rochel network is established months after he establishes a boys' network in Williamsburg. And it's important to note that, with the boys' network, he actually insisted on, it just reveals how we've undergone a passage of time, he insisted on an English language instruction for boys, because he thought, the Satmar way was to learn in the morning and the evening, but to insist that at least men be gainfully employed. So two kind of idiosyncrasies drawn from the educational history of Satmar Hasidism. Okay, now to my 3 points.
Okay.
I want to offer just a few reflections on Joel Teitelbaum's biography to highlight some what I think are key points that may fill out the picture, and I do that mindful of the fact that there are some students of mine in the class who may not be familiar with Joel Teitelbaum, and they're drawn to this lecture both because of your hypnotic and hypnotizing account of Teitelbaum, and because I've offered extra credit for them to show up. So.
Extra credit always works.
Yeah. And the clock has struck exactly at that time. I want to do just a very brief amount of mapping of anti-Zionism, which it's important to note was born essentially with Zionism, right? If you think of the First Zionist Congress of 1897, sort of one of the most significant moments in the history of anti-Zionism is, as Molly Crabapple has recently reminded us, the founding of the Bund in Vilna in 1897, the same year. So the contiguity of those, I think, is an important historical point to make. And then I want to use those two exercises to really say a word about what I see as some of the really deep tensions in Teitelbaum's book that I think I want to surface a bit more and maybe hear thoughts of our panel about. So just a very brief biography. Joel Teitelbaum, the Satmar Rebbe, was born in the northeast quadrant of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in what was then known as Sighet, Hungary, to a distinguished Hasidic family, which was notable for its commitment to combat the forces of pollution that were so prevalent in modernity. The Teitelbaum family was sort of bathed in martial imagery, in engaging in battle in order to carve out a domain of purity for the Torah true Jew. The Torah true Jew was the term of art in this time. And Joel Teitelbaum inherited that mantle from his father, the Kedushas Yom Tov, and his grandfather. Even he quotes extensively his great-great-grandfather Yismach Moshe in this book. But that was the family business, was to combat the forces of evil and pollution and contamination in the world around. And in their worldview, really, the ones who seemed most proximate were often deemed the most dangerous, right? Hence, the fanatical opposition to the Agudas Yisrael in the sort of first major organization established in 1912 to represent ultra-Orthodox Judaism, deemed a very grave threat to Teitelbaum. So Joel Teitelbaum grows up with that background. He kind of makes his way as a young rabbinic prodigy in a number of communities where he serves as the town rabbi before making his way, not actually until 1934, to a town called Satmar in Hungarian, Satmar in Romanian, and there he really establishes himself as the most important leader of the ultra-Orthodox version of Judaism, having probably inherited the mantle from his neighbor with whom he inveighed against the Aguda in 1922, the Munkacher Rebbe. And it's there that I think he develops, and this is, I guess, it's there that he develops, I think, something other than just a messianic sense of time, other than a messianic sense of politics. He develops a sensibility about how to build a community, because he also was a community builder. He went from one community to another, and he didn't go to destroy only. He did go, indeed, to introduce a new measure of ritual stringency, but he also went to build. And I think that's important. I'll say more about that when we get to the tensions. Then survives the Holocaust, even though 85 to 90% of the Jewish community from where he came was deported to death camps and murdered. Makes his way to the United States, 1946. Rosh Hashanah, he arrives in the port of New York, settles in Williamsburg and Brooklyn, and there begins the work of reconstituting the community that once was. And here too, I think he reveals a kind of extraordinary capacity to not only build a community, but to engage in secular politics. He always had a chief consigliere whose job it was to engage the king, the mayor, the governor, and this is, I think, part of the Satmar brand, is the willingness to operate on these multiple levels, right? The willingness to operate at the level of, we hold in abeyance these efforts to bring the redemption, because that's false messianism, and we're absolutely not just willing, we're enthusiastic to engage in a mundane version of politics in the here and now. So he does that most famously by creating a community about an hour away from New York that bears his name, called Kiryas Yoel, the village of Joel, which is the embodiment of a true Satmar political entity, right? It's too bad nobody has written on that. But it stands, as I understand it, as a kind of decidedly uncelestial counter-Zion. And so that brings us back to the second task, which is to map what anti-Zionism looks like prior to the contemporary conversation about anti-Zionism. It's akin to what I have once said, like uncovering the lost Atlantis of anti-Zionism. So there's the anti-Zionism that was born, with the advent of the Zionist movement, namely the Bund, kind of socialist version of anti-Zionism. So there's various forms of political Zionism. There's a cultural Zionism that I think reflected a kind of assimilationist sensibility that said, we don't find any reason whatsoever to imagine a homeland other than the place in which we live.
A cultural anti-Zionism, you mean?
Pardon me?
A cultural
Anti-Zionism, sorry, anti-Zionism, sorry, thank you. There's a religious anti-Zionism reflected in an organization like the American Council for Judaism, which bore strong connections to that cultural Zionism in saying our homeland is here, it's in Berlin, it's in New York, it's in Cincinnati. There's a philosophical, pardon me?
We don't say that anymore.
There's a philosophical anti-Zionism, which is connected to, perhaps the most famous exponent of that would be the German Jewish philosopher Hermann Cohen. And there's a theological anti-Zionism, which is, I think, distinct from what I think of as the religious Zionism. And that is something that Teitelbaum really embodies, I think, as well as anybody. These are all kind of related streams of anti-Zionism that populate the landscape of Jewish culture prior to the Second World War. And I think it's important to think about that historical chapter and really understand both the interconnectivity and the ways in which they're distinctive. And I mention this because I often vex over the extent to which Teitelbaum himself absorbed osmotically, not in any direct or overt fashion, knowledge of what was going on the ground. I think, as a general matter, Haredi Judaism inherits some of the organizational and communication strategies of Jewish ideologies, including Jewish nationalist ideologies, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And one of the interesting, questions that comes up is, what is Teitelbaum reading and thinking? You make frequent reference to the figure of the Antichrist in this book, right? Does Joel Teitelbaum know about the theological tradition of the Antichrist?
No.
Most likely not, right? But does he know about, the debates between Zionists and anti-Zionists that are taking place in East Central Europe, which Josh has written so extensively about? I think he did.
Yeah, he did.
And I think not only did he, but he developed his own kind of counter-political vision. Right. And that's, I guess, where I want to end, just by highlighting a number of the tensions that I see in the book, the most important of which is that between that messianic politics that you both have talked about and the very mundane counter-politics that I think is reflected in Teitelbaum's deeds. Yeah. So some of the tensions that are just so interesting are the advocacy of peace, right? and the martial quality, the commitment to combat, the repeated, the recurrent appeal to a milchemet mitzvah, to a commanded war in Satmar ideology. The resistance, the fierce resistance to assimilation, and the way in which Teitelbaum is absorbing from the ambient environment all sorts of ideas that create something other than the arch anti-assimilationist. The tension between spoken Hebrew and written Hebrew, right? I found perhaps most interesting the tension between Teitelbaum's characteristic certainty, theological certainty, and his rather uncharacteristic uncertainty, which you call attention to at various points. Who am I, he says, verbatim, who am I? Joel Teitelbaum? Yeah. You are the leader of Torah True Judaism, is who you are. What do you mean, who am I? The need for exile as a kind of space of conditioning and preparation for redemption, and the desire for redemption. And then just the tension between messianic and mundane politics, I think, is present. I mean, in thinking of what folks here had to say, I mean, there are elements both of the classic Yiddish Doigkeit in Teitelbaum and the German Jewish Jetztzeit, now time, sort of time and space here in Teitelbaum that I think complicates the story of he's just an advocate of messianic politics.
Right. No, for sure. Thank you.
You want to say something?
Just very briefly, because I really just want to open it up. One of the things that I think is worth asking is, like, why? What can this do for us now in this time? Most of us are not going to believe in the basic theological premises that Teitelbaum adheres to, right? And yet, there's something about, for me personally, the problem of living in a moment in time, certainly within the Jewish world, of a certain kind of reflexive certainty about the Jewish national project, about Zionism. Like, there's just certainty that there's a way in which the very notion of doubting whether it's useful or doubting whether it's sustainable is almost become blasphemous. And I think Teitelbaum offers another alternative which at most maybe can poke a hole in that certainty. And I mean, you talked about longevity. I mean, in a certain way, you talk about longevity. I mean, it's a great point. It's a long story. And we're living in one moment of the story, and in some way we think we're living at the end of the story. And I think that the way in which Teitelbaum forces us to say that the story is a long story, and what might be, that's the Zizek lost causes, right? What me lost can be found. When I once had I had a very short conversation with somebody, and I mentioned just in passing about, one day when there isn't a state of Israel, and they said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I don't know, it's like not going to last forever. Like, the Roman Empire didn't last forever. Like, nothing lasts forever. Nationalism is only 150 years old. So we live in this moment where we imagine that we're at the end of something. And probably a lot of people in a lot of different historical contexts did. As opposed to saying, yeah, there's this moment and there's the next moment. No one could have imagined the Jewish state 100 years ago. And why can't we imagine that something else will be? That nationalism in general, that the whole concept of the world order is changing before our very eyes. And I think that in a way that might be, the outside of the erudition and the scholarship and everything, that might be useful to say, it's a long story. Human civilization is a long story. And there's some danger in feeling like we're at the end of it. Anyway, let's open it up.
Let's open up. So let's see how many questions we have. All right, we'll start back there, and then we'll make our way over here. And Neil is. Okay, so hold on. I'm going to just write down.
For the extra credit.
No. Time gets extra credit.
Because you get double extra credit if you ask a question.
We've asked a lot of questions and been a lot of talks. Yeah. Could you just introduce yourself, if you don't mind?
Sure, my name is Iris Morel, also Molka. I'm a graduate student at UC Irvine, actually, but I just came for this. Nice to meet you all, if we haven't met. Okay, I have two questions, but one is simpler than the other. My first question is about Yiddish. Like I said, Yiddish, I don't know. So I'm curious if you see Teitelbaum's investment in Yiddish as part of his political theology. Like, and it's also interesting because you're talking about translation. Obviously, his form written in Hebrew, but he was a proponent of Yiddish. So I'm just curious if you think that's part of the political theology. And then my second question is about Messianism, because now I'm wondering what it means, right? Like probably all of us to some extent are. And I wonder, like, because all of these political thinkers that you mentioned are dealing with Messianism in one way or another, I think it begs the question of, like, are we in an era where just everything is Messianic and this has our perception of history, right? And, like, I think that's the ultra-Orthodox thing in the philosophy of history, is like this weak Messianism where there's kind of no option outside of it. And I wonder if that's, like, characteristic of, I don't know, like modernity, like the 20th century onward or something. And then it also made me think about, like, beyond Walter Benjamin, also, like, what Elliot Wolfson has said about Chabad and how Messianism, like, you're in a Messianic era, and there's kind of, like, you know, he talks about, like, individual Messianism, Messianic consciousness, but these are all just ways of saying, like, there's no outside of Messianism.
Right.
So I wonder if that's something that you agree with or are sympathetic to.
Right.
You know what, maybe just give
Take
me
a few,
time.
yeah.
We'll take a few
Yeah,
questions.
yeah.
and
Okay, sure.
Just make sure to.
Yeah,
to
sure.
understand that. Amy.
I wanted to say that I come from a background which is very staunchly labor Zionist, and at the same time I have Chabad in my family background, and so I cannot overstate the feeling of subversiveness that I'm even at this lecture, and I feel like I practically had to come here hiding under a cape, because Satmar and Vayoel Teitelbaum is not anything that we're allowed to come near. And yet, ever since I saw that you were writing the book, and of course knowing and David, it's been more and more fascinating to me. So my two questions are: one, do you, and both David and you, I'm asking this question, but mostly maybe Shaul, do you have a sense of him as a man, as being deeply a mensch and a gentleman? Because where I am in life right now, I don't listen to men who are not mensches and gentlemen at all. I just don't want to know from them. So I'd like to know to what degree is he a gentleman and a mensch? And also I'm wondering, is anywhere in his teaching, anywhere do you find a care, in his anti-Zionism, a care for the others that were already in Palestine before we got there? Nowadays it's become very popular, but I think it was almost all AI generated. But there's a lot of messages out there that actually Satmar were really very deeply concerned about the Palestinians. It's hard for me to believe, but I'm interested if you find that there anywhere in his writing.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Chaim.
So,
You're Chaim. Yeah.
What?
By way of introduction.
It seems to me that the Satmar Rebbe, before he came to the United States, went to Israel.
Yeah.
So, and what was that all?
Lived
there. And what was that all about? What did he want to do there?
Yeah.
In other words,
Okay.
It's clear that he wanted to do something there, and he didn't succeed there.
He went to Palestine.
Yeah, read the Palestine.
Right.
All right, that's that.
Right.
Number one. Number two, I'm really sort of kind of taken aback by the fact that, four intelligent people, ostensibly modernists,
Thanks.
speak so glowingly about a reactionary who has nothing theologically to tell me that allows me to live a meaningful religious life, because he rejects my ability
Sure.
to have a role in the world, because it's only God who has a role in the world, and I'm merely a pawn. Even in the politics that they do, that's got, excuse the term, it's gai shenachas, it's not really important. In other words, we can do politics because that's anyway corrupt. So we can join with the corruption and do that. Right? So I'd like to talk about that, because I don't know what type of model is it. In other words, he robs us of our agency. And I don't have to be this is not about Zionism. This is about a religious world.
Yeah.
It's a religious world that doesn't produce a framework that allows me to be a human being in the 21st century. He wants me to wear a fur coat, right, and live in the 17th, 18th century, whatever it is, in worldview. I'm not just talking about, right? And so that's, I mean, we have to be careful about what we praise him for, number one. Number two, I didn't hear the question on Mark, a little harder, but I think you mentioned something about Lubavitch. Did you say something about it?
Yeah.
I mean, because the contrast, because that's worth talking about, the messianism of Lubavitch as against the anti-messianism or the rejection, and what Lubavitch means religiously, and why it's such a threat to Satmar, and why Satmar, I mean, in other words, you're talking about, that's interesting to me, that battle.
Yeah.
And the third point I would make, and here I don't know whether I'm right, but
Everything else you
Everything else you said was right. Okay, as long as we got that.
I draw a degree of modesty from the Satmar Rebbe who was certain in his theology.
Okay.
With his modesty. Okay. So, and that is that sometimes when I read his writings, I'm impressed by the fact that he really seems to be concerned about the violence that's a consequence of politics. Mm-hmm. And in other words, I wonder, you put all this stuff on Mashiach and the 3 oaths. That's okay, you cannot. That's a way of arguing a textual argument. But there's something much more substantive that he's presenting to me, and to that extent, I do find it meaningful, and that is, he recognizes that when we get involved in politics, we kill a lot of people, and we get involved in the world where we become a player in this game of bloodshed. So I wonder what in your reading, how much of a role does that play in his working out, and whether that's not worthwhile emphasizing, because you didn't talk about that as a value. Right. What's the value of his theological position, not what his theological position is.
Right.
All right, we'll take one question here. I see a second round. We'll do one round here, and then we'll do a second round. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Neely. I'm a professor of, I'm a student of Professor Myers.
We reverse the role.
And I have 2 questions, actually, both of which were kind of touched upon by their questions. Touched upon by her question was, I've seen images of Hasidim, kind of disrupting Zionist, Zionist programming and whatever, and they're utilizing Palestinian flags, right? Which I've been very interested about because they don't seem like the type to bandwagon, to kind of compromise their values and kind of make them conform to make them more popular. So I've been curious about that, if it's actually part of their values, and I think that she touched on that about his sympathy for Palestinians. Right. And then with Rabbi Chaim's question of him stopping in Israel, living in Israel or Palestine. Yeah. I wasn't going to ask about this because I didn't know how important it was, but I was curious. That there are large Hasidic communities that live in Israel, and I have seen them, and they're very anti-Israel, right? They try not to draft, and they avoid the draft and everything, right? And they curse out Israeli police, and I've just been curious why they would live in Israel, because it is obviously a very big support of the government to be living there, right? So that's something I'm interested in.
Great. Okay. Why don't you start, and we'll.
Okay. I'm trying to think if I should go backward or forward. Let me try to go from the beginning. Just very quickly. The Messianism point is a much bigger point for sure, but it also relates to the Chabad question. So, Yiddish was the world that was the world that he lived in. But one of the interesting things about Teitelbaum as a Hasidic figure is that he took a very strong interest in Jews from Arab lands, especially Jews from Yemen. Mm-hmm. He saw the Jews from Yemen as the real, authentic Jews that were not affected by modernity. And he worked very hard to, in some cases, stealing children actually, but very hard to take these Jews from Arab lands that were being Zionized and put into children's villages and separated from their parents and cutting off their payas there weren't many Eastern European Jewish leaders that really took much an interest in the world of Mizrach. So that's a kind of interesting point to make in terms of him as a figure. And well, there's a long story about the kidnapping a child from.
One person's kidnap is another person's rescue.
Yussel, right. He wasn't really directly involved in that, but yes. I do want to, I mean, in terms of Amy's question, I didn't know him personally, but I do know a lot of people who did know him, and David can speak to this more than me, but he actually did have a reputation of being an incredibly caring person, right, as an individual. And this is going to the question of Elizabeth Chaim's question too. During the 6-Day War, he raised millions of dollars to send to Israel, right? So the idea that somehow he didn't care about Jews that weren't like him was simply really not true, right? I mean, he was very strict within the kind of milieu that he lived in, but he was a person who had a deep sense of love for Jews. He just felt like most of them were actually, going off the wrong way. So I have a couple of anecdotes I could tell if we have time about the way in which he actually cared for people within his community and outside of it. In terms of he goes over the border to Switzerland. He's saved by the Katzner transport, which is a Zionist transport that's traded Jews for trucks, and got 1,000 Jews got on this train, and his name was put on there because he had connections and whatever. But when he gets over the border from Switzerland, he's asked, "Do you want to go to Palestine or America?" And it was never a question for him to go to Palestine, because for him, the holy, it's Eretz Yisrael. I mean, there was the idea of the sanctity of living in the land was so deep and strong in him that he never wanted to go to America. He ended up in America for all kinds of reasons. He goes to raise money for his yeshiva in Jerusalem, and he ends up there. So it was never an issue. Now, that's the difference between Eretz Yisrael and a state is categorical for him, and not only for him. I mean, one of the things that he says at some point orally, that when he's reflecting on how much resistance he's getting for the views that he has, he said, "I don't understand, like, where I grew up, everyone thought like this. Like, I wasn't unique here. I wasn't singular. All the Jews in Northeast Hungary and in Romania thought like I thought. I mean, the Haredi Jews, not." So, to the question of Chabad and Satmar, that's a much longer story. It has a lot to do with turf wars in Brooklyn. I mean, it really is not, it has to do with the fact that Chabad saw itself as the unique inheritors of the Baal Shem Tov, and the Satmar Rebbe famously said, "We no longer have a tradition of the Baal Shem Tov." So there was a lot of the way in which the Jews in Poland and Galicia and Hungary, they didn't really think Chabad were real Hasidim. Right? Because Chabad were like living in White Russia. They were living separate from the rest of the Hasidic world. So I will say though, and I think it's important to say that the Lubavitch Rebbe, the Satmar Rebbe, Reb Soloveitchik, Reb Yitzhak Kutner, there was a whole generation of these bridge figures of people that grew up in Europe, in Eastern Europe before the war, and survived the war and ended up in America. And they all actually had a lot in common with each other, right? So people will say that, like, Abraham Joshua Heschel and Saul Lieberman at the Jewish Theological Seminary hated each other. But Susanna tells me that on Shabbat they used to take walks together in Riverside Park and talk Yiddish to each other. So there were ideological battles that came from Europe, and it's not that they resolved them in America, but they really were people that had a lot more in common with each other than they had in common with people who were like us, for example. The real sin, the original sin of Zionism for Teitelbaum, and for not only Teitelbaum, Tomaris and many others, the idea of being like all the other nations. The raison d'etre of Zionism was its original sin for these people. For the Jew to be like all the other nations was to abandon the covenantal inheritance. And that was very, very deep for all these figures. The idea to be like everybody else was arguably one of the real kind of, the raison d'etre of the Zionist project, which was the collapse of any kind of covenantal theology for them. And so I think it's really important to note that Zionism was, and this is something that David noted, which is actually very true. When people talk about Zionism as the abandonment of Judaism, Zionism, the replacement, that kind of radical Zionism that Teitelbaum talks about, that really existed in his time, right? We can think about it now because religion has come back into the Zionist project. People like Berdichevsky and Brenner, they were saying, no, we are heretics, right? Berdichevsky said, I'm the last Jew and the first Hebrew, right? They were really radical thinkers. And so Teitelbaum is not making this up in his head. These people were trying to undermine Judaism. And not only his mind, in reality. So that was, I think, also, I do want to speak about, very quickly, it is true, and here people like Aaron Shmuel Tamaris and others are very important. Teitelbaum basically understood, like Hannah Arendt, and I'm sure they didn't read each other, that
They were taking walks over here.
right, and they lived on they lived a subway right away. If you have a state, you go to war. If you go to war, you kill people. If you have a state, you have refugees. That's the reality of having a state. And Arendt, for different reasons, and Teitelbaum said that Jews should not do that. And so he's not a pacifist the way Tamaris was. But he basically said, if we're going to have a state, we're going to become murderers. And he was right. That is the reality of having a state. You can't have a state without killing people, especially in the neighborhood that Israel is. I just, one more comment, and then I'll open it up to some others, because you said you wanted to say something. There's a real distinction between Satmar and the Neturei Karta, which I talked about. So Neturei Karta is a movement that was actually founded by someone else named Amram Bloy in Palestine, which was an anti-Zionist movement. Satmar and Neturei Karta in some way had relationships with each other until the 1960s. After the PLO was founded in 1964, Arafat becomes the head of it in 1966. Amram Bloy, the head of Neturei Karta, starts to actually talk to Arafat. Teitelbaum basically says, that's it, I'm done. You don't talk to the enemy. Right? And he refused that. So a lot of the people at the protests are really Neturei Karta. And the interesting thing about Neturei Karta is that over the last couple of years since the protests, they've begun to absorb a certain kind of pro-Palestinian, Palestinian rights, humanistic. Now, whether that was tactical in the beginning, it may have been. I think it's actually become more integral to their way of thinking. So when you hear the Neturei Karta people talk about Palestinian rights, Teitelbaum never talked about Palestinian rights, right? And Teitelbaum basically said, if you're a Jew and you're an anti-Zionist because you believe in the three oaths, you're a good Jew. If you're a non-Jew and you're an anti-Zionist, you're an anti-Semite. That's basically the way he saw things. I mean, there was no humanistic pro-Palestinian thing. Neturei Karta has begun to absorb that, and I don't think Teitelbaum would have ever walked around with a keffiyeh around his neck.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a kind of interesting change, and I think it's an interesting shift. There's a guy named Martin Saps who is a scholar in England who's been writing about the Neturei Karta in England. So,
Okay, maybe we'll
let me stop.
Brothers want to?
Yeah, please, yeah.
And then we have some other questions. So-
Yeah.
There was
Be
something.
Go ahead,
first.
go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, I just wanted to, there's two things actually. There's this beautiful prayer at some point in the early part of the book in which Teitelbaum sort of longs for God to strike down the Zionists rather than anybody else, because he sort of says, like, he doesn't want it to be at the hands of any other nation, so that there should not be a new Amalek or a new Nebuchadnezzar or a new Rome, right? Because then Jews would die. right? So that this should actually, like, insofar as the state should be also God, so should the end of Zionism should be God-driven rather than human. And I think that elevation, that's it, I get it. But you asked about the value, and I will just say that I get the question 100%, right? When I was reading the Tochacha thing, the reason that it pulled out so much for me is the way in which Tochacha has become a new value. And this is mostly from liberal congregations, but also from some Orthodox. The way that Tochacha, the deployment of Tochacha against the current Israeli government, from a religious perspective, is actually brilliantly done from Teitelbaum. Now, whether you want to use him as your source is a different question, but the value is he questions proxy Judaism. He questions giving money for the scholars in Israel. He's questioning what's your goal? What are you doing, right? And then if it's not for the right reason, now whether you think it's the right reason or not is up to you to decide, but he gives us a whole series, this is the hermeneutics of obligation, a whole series of things that one must do as a committed Jew. So just because he doesn't do it the way that I might want to do it, doesn't mean that the value of learning the methodology is not important. Which is
yeah, just a couple very brief, quick things. So in terms of messianism that you asked about, who's now maybe leaving, Eliezer Rubitsky in his important book on Zionism and Messianism points out that messianic traditions in Judaism, there's a lot of different ones, and they're mostly agadita, they're mostly non-halachic, and what all of these voices are doing is drawing selectively from them and also elevating things that are non-halachic into halacha. The three oaths was, like many things in modern, in contemporary Orthodoxy, three oaths had no halachic obligation, arguably, until it did. And so, and Cook will draw on other things and rethink them with what he called creative midrash. So I think it's important to keep that in mind in terms of messianism. In terms of Chabad, just because it felt like, Amy, Chabad is anti-Zionist. So the idea that I'm Chabad, so I can't. Chabad is. The most important anti-Zionist thinker 120 years ago was not Shapira yet, the Munkacher Rebbe. It was the Rashab. It was the fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe. The fifth Lubavitcher Rebbe was by far the most important anti-Zionist figure. And to this day, Chabad remains theoretically anti-Zionist, although it's complicated by its pro-Israelism. But it's very anti-Zionist theoretically. They won't ever call it Medinas Yisrael, and they don't have a flag, and lots of things. If you've never seen a tikva. Yeah, they're very. Yeah. So in any event, so that's just one comment there. And finally, in terms of the question, why, you said I get it. I don't get it, and I'd say two things. There is you could point out the things in there that it's geschmack. It's geschmack. Like the proof text he brings are. How do you say geschmack? It's tasty, he models integrity and things like that. But the biggest thing is why read it? You're a rabbi. You've spent a lot of years learning Gemara. There's almost nothing in Gemara that is going to affect. A third of it is about the korbanos. A lot of it has to do with children being married. It's not guiding me in my life today. But we learn it because it's Torah. It's the basis of Judaism. I don't know why this would be in a different category than those pages of Gemara, Seder Kiddushin or something.
Yeah. So I have an answer to that question as well, the why question, but I want to begin the messianism question. What I think of in response to your question is sort of the classic formulation of Gershom Scholem when he was in writing about Sabbatianism and the messianic idea in Judaism, in which he describes messianism as the sort of experience and ideology of life lived in deferment. Sort of a suspension of the end of days theology or activism. And you could look at that in one of two ways. You could say well, that's a kind of state of paralysis, or it's saying, I'm not so sure how good that day after is. I think I'm going to devote myself to Ha-Geulah Mazeh, this worldly activity. And I think there are two ways which one can see that. And that's how he understood messianism in a kind of his typically subversive way. Was Teitelbaum a mensch? All I can tell you is to hear the anecdotes of Satmar Hasidim describe not only what it was like to be in his presence, but to have him cast his gaze upon you and kind of imprint, as if kind of chisel out on your face an impression of what kindness was. One account after another is
very compelling. He can be, a brutal polemicist, but that is what you hear from his followers. And it was largely restricted to his followers, which amplifies the point Shaul made. He never heard of and couldn't care less about Palestinians. They were absolutely not on his radar. But you do hear, so there's this, in the immediate circle of Satmar Hasidim, he was revered not only because of his erudition, not only because of how forceful he was, but because of his kindness. Mr. Karta already is enamored of Palestinian rights and I think a humanistic sensibility. Earlier in the, already in the 70s, they're already taking out full-page ads in the New York Times. Whether it's sincere or tactical, polemical, I don't know, but it's got a long tradition, and it is the next chapter after Netzrei Karta actually formally looked to Joel Teitelbaum as its spiritual leader in the shortly after it was founded. Chaim's question, why? Well, if I were to accept the logic of that, Josh says, well, we'd exclude, the study of Gemara. I mean, do you find any value in reading Spinoza?
That wasn't my question.
No. It was about free will. It was about Spinoza, altogether dispenses with the free will. I mean, do you find any value in reading Leibovich? I mean, someone who also really dispatches with free will. So, I mean, I think if on philosophical grounds you're going to rule someone out for that because they afford you no agency, then I think you're going to deprive yourself of some of the most interesting philosophical thinkers in modern times. So let me finish. No, Chaim, let me finish. Why? So there's that very important philosophical point. There's then why. Well, if you, for example, if you see value, to use your term, in life in the diaspora, right? Even in the exilic condition, right? Then I think you can find something of benefit in reading Joel Teitelbaum. If you see something bracing about his critique of Zionism as having the potential to do what Shaul said, to become a state that engages in wars that kill people, something that may fail a moral test, then I think there is value in reading Joel Teitelbaum. I think, if you think that politics of a certain mundane sort can eventuate in violence, and maybe even violence may be mandated by it, then I think you will see value in what he is, which is a radical reactionary. That's really what he is. I mean, he's absolutely a reactionary in all the ways that you've said, but he's also radical and sort of breaks out of the mold in sort of the most compelling ways. It seems to me the question is the opposite. How could you not read him if you're interested in sort of or drawn to iconoclastic novel use? I know we have other questions, so maybe we'll just take the questions and then we'll get back to it. Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
If any of these questions are in the book, you could just not answer them. But I've read the tablet articles on Teitelbaum over the past, and then reviews of the biographies are from both sycophants and non about the controversy over what really happened with the people he was supposed to be looking after and everything. What did he think about the Inquisition then? You talked about that he looks in biblical times and that he attributes the Holocaust to 3 books on Zionism or something. So the Inquisition was also quite serious, and I wondered if you talked about that. I secondly, thinking of the way Chabad has grown into this kind of global network, and I wonder, personally, I often wonder, if anti-Zionism, this is a kind of crazy way of thinking of it, if the Satmar Rebbe is trying to just expand the vocabulary of Jewish thought in a way without really taking things to their logical conclusions, because to me, what I wonder, thinking of Judaism over the last few thousand years, is with Zionism, what's really been inevitable is that whether it's drained or not, and I say this as a Zionist, but I'm trying to just frame things just theoretically, it drains a lot of our energies over just this kind of one issue, right, which is ultimately about things like land and safety and survival, whereas in reality it's quite measurable that much of the world is at an unprecedented pace going to completely untethered from any kind of monotheistic Ten Commandment value system. If you see what goes on internally in China and Russia, China's relationship with Africa, and all these things. And from 1900 on, we've never, it's kind of like a clear lack of influence and power in all kinds of soft power ways of the Jewish sensibility, the Jewish point of view. Anyway, so is Teitelbaum in any way aware of these things? Because one of the things I see the Lubavitcher Rebbe is oftentimes quite aware of these things and is trying to engage in all these things. Where is his stance on that? Because to me, again,
Okay, so I think we get.
Okay, you get
Yeah,
my point.
yeah.
How worldly is-
Anti-Zionism, but what about the global situation?
Right.
How worldly is he
Yeah.
about global?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
More of a context question than a content question. I'm curious about who's your ideal audience that reads this book, and then who's the actual audience that you think should read this book? Because if you're saying it's a sefer, and then you started by saying you had to learn, then that to me communicates that this book actually isn't for everybody. There's a requirement of learning to read.
Right.
So I'm curious.
Good question, yeah.
Ideal
Yeah,
audience.
okay.
actual.
Okay.
question.
Yes.
I think my question actually builds on hers.
Good.
And maybe it's a bit of a softball question. But I was thinking if it's a sefer, I was looking at the book, and it doesn't look like a sefer. And the way it's packaged and the title, and I think of all the choices, I actually thought it was a secondary source. I didn't pay a lot of attention. I saw the title, and I assumed it was a secondary source, and I didn't realize it was a primary source, but it's packaged more like a secondary source. And I was thinking about why did you make those choices? And I'm really curious, because I haven't seen the inside of it, in what ways does it function like a sefer? What kind of choices do you have to make?
Okay.
That make it more like a sefer?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. Thanks.
Okay.
Very
Maybe just reiterate for folks what the difference between a book and sefer is. Just
Okay, well,
remind
I mean,
everybody.
again, as a book is something that is meant to be read. You sit down, you read it, page. There's a continuity to it, right? A sefer is basically a series of either exegetical moves or homiletical moves or engagements with other texts that's around a subject, but it's not necessarily making a continuous argument from beginning to end, right? It doesn't have a systematic quality to it. I do want to answer these questions. I just want to say one thing to Chaim, just because I didn't respond. It reminded me of something that I saw in this person named Rav Shagar, who's it's kind of inside baseball, but anyway, a contemporary kind of rabbi from a settlement rabbi, but very kind of progressive, postmodern. He has it in his book about the disengagement from Gaza. He says there are three major thinkers that are kind of operative within our world. Rabbi Soloveitchik, Rav Kook, and Leibovich. None of them are relevant anymore. None of them have any relevant because each one of them is embedded in the modern context, and we've moved on to. So who is the person that's relevant in this postmodern world? Nachman of Bratslav is the first postmodern thinker. So I think it's important to think about the way in which I think there's a way in which the people that we were raised on are thinking in a paradigm that no longer exists. That's his reading of it. So I just wanted to kind of raise that as an issue. It's funny, he was not as globally sophisticated as the Lubavitcher Rebbe. But he saw things in a very similar way in that he lived within the world of covenantal theology. Right? He lived in the world that the Jews were the center of everything, that the world revolves around them, it revolves around the covenantal experience and the exile and the eventual redemption. And whereas Lubavitcher Rebbe he had to be more interested in the global world because his people were out in the world. He had people in China and people in India, right? So what was happening in the world mattered more. But he didn't have the sophistication, I think, as a figure, the way the Lubavitcher Rebbe did. He didn't have the secular education that Lubavitcher Rebbe did. And he didn't have the interest. As I think David, he was a warrior of conservation. And I just want to, one other point. within kind of Christian millenarianism, there are these two categories of post-millennial and premillennialists. The post-millennialists are the social gospelers. You know, you go out into the world, you create the conditions for the Messianic era, for the return of Christ, right? Chabad is Jewish social gospelism.
Yeah.
Right? And then you have the premillennialists who say, no, we have to be the surviving remnant. We have to separate ourselves from the world. When everything collapses, we're going to be the ones that are going to be left. That was what Teitelbaum was.
Yeah.
So you have this kind of division of premillennial, postmillennialism that really kind of emerges in these two contemporary Hasidic movements. He does talk, frankly, about the Inquisition. He talks about Sabbatianism. He talks about all these things that for him just filter into this covenantal model, right? It's really the Jews sin, they're punished. That's basically the end of the story for him, right? And you can understand world history through understanding of the idea of reward and punishment as it affects the Jews. The audience for the book, it's a very great question. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think that what bothered me about the Teitelbaum story, and I think certainly in David's book, David Nomi's book, they kind of move it in a different direction, and also in Nathaniel Deutsch's book, is that everybody, as I said, everybody knows what he thinks, but nobody's actually ever looked at how he does it. And what I
Thinks
hope,
they know what he thinks.
well, yeah, well, they know the shita, as they say. There's a beauty to the way this person's mind, interpretive mind, works. All right, and it's an aesthetic, really. And what I tried to reproduce in the book is that this is not only an ideologue. This is a person who is deeply engaged in the aesthetic exercise of interpretation. And I think when you bring that out, you get a much richer and textured view of it. So, I mean, I don't know who's going to read the book, but I hope that it at least gives access. If somebody's really interested in this guy, this is a place to go, and not to you go on some YouTube thing where some guy says this is what the Satmar Rebbe says. Was there another? Did I miss something?
Just the decisions made about the aesthetics.
Oh, I mean, I have to turn tomorrow because we were working together on this. I don't know. I just thought this was a cool aesthetic. I have no idea. There's.
It doesn't look like a safer, but it's a safer.
You should put gold on the binding so that.
Right. I have to do a pleather version.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Right.
Hold on. I think we have a couple other questions. You know what we're going to do? We're just going to take the questions. If we have time, which we probably don't, we may not answer them, but we do want the questions to be heard. So let's just have the questions heard. We'll begin with you, and if you just tell us who you are.
I'll skip the Nachman question I had.
Okay, good.
This is open to all, and you can answer or not. I'm curious. It's about anti-Zionist theology. We're having this talk in a very academic space. Molly Crabapple is speaking on Shabbos in Echo Park in an art space, also talking about theology and Jewish spirituality in terms of Zionism, anti-Zionism. How do we have these conversations in theological places? How do we have these conversations in the actual shuls and Jewish communities where people who don't have access to this place or aren't online enough to know who the fuck Molly Crabapple is?
Right. It's a great name.
Okay. We got it.
It's really a great name. You got to see.
Yes, please.
I'm from California. I specialize in another nature my question to piggyback off our first question and your answer is, so how many people do you expect to buy this Shafir today? And you don't have to answer that if you don't want to. There's not enough time.
As many people as possible.
Okay, that's it. All right. I think you had a question.
Yeah. I mean, if I may, I think one of the possible uses of this book is that this is a primer for any anti-Zionist rabbi or anti-Zionist curious rabbi to develop political theology today that is anti-Zionist.
Right.
And I think the cover of the book I did wonder about that. To me, it calls back to sort of the iconography of that famous poster of Obama speaking to a particular kind of progressive politics. And it seems to me that this book could absolutely speak in a very practical, pragmatic way, following on from Leia's remarks about methodology being the utility here. You take from it what you will, but it seems to me to be an invitation for further anti-Zionist political theology that is used, as you said, in the synagogues right now, potentially.
Right.
Can I?
We're going to take the last question, and then we'll have a final one.
Question about the relationship between
About
the relationship between Teitelbaum and Rabbi Yoel. I work with settlers as a research topic, and when you talk to them, they're obviously these days extremely messianic. And they kind of use the same language that you described Teitelbaum using, climate punishment or war, reward, and they kind of map it on, for them, October 7th was sort of like the moment of destruction that came after a great sin. And then the tradition of the land that they're experiencing through settlement is sort of evidence of divine, kind of like a divine sign that they're doing the right thing. They are bringing forth redemption. So I guess I don't really have a question, but I'm kind of curious to hear from you about this kind of how these two models are contrasting or what we think through this.
Right. I mean, in the
just set the parameters. Take like 2 minutes to.
Yeah.
And then
In the book in the monograph that's on the table, I have long sections on Teitelbaum and Cook because I think they actually share a lot more than we think. They also differ in obvious ways, but they share a lot more. So it's not surprising that this kind of language would come up. I've forgotten the other questions.
Question about anti-Zionism in the shul.
I'll tell you something. I'll tell you something. I don't know if this is true or not. I have been prohibited from speaking in many synagogues. No, seriously. Not even because of this book. I was recently told that I was invited to speak in a synagogue, in a very prominent conservative synagogue in Manhattan, and that the policy of the synagogue is that anybody who is not a Zionist is prohibited from speaking from the pulpit. So I think that this is not, I think there won't be a lot of synagogues that will allow me to speak about this book, which says a lot. I mean, I think that Molly's book is a little different because I don't think the Bund is as threatening, because it's not as alive in the way, I mean, it is in a certain way, it's reviving itself, but it just doesn't have the same kind of threat because it's not coming from a place of Torah in a certain sense.
It's a cultural thing versus this.
Versus a theological thing. And what, excuse me, you just very quickly, what?
How many copies?
Yeah, so you can say, yeah.
As possible, and I said that was the wisest answer you could give.
Yes,
Maybe wrap up with your expectation of how many copies of the book will be
I don't know.
sold.
I mean, you know, with it being open access, who really knows?
How many downloads might be
right?
the
How many?
relevance?
But I will say, I think that to your question, I really hope Zionists read this. I mean, I really hope that people say that, you know, those people who were sitting in that yeshiva in Gush Etzion laughing, right? I hope that they'll read it because I also provide a lot of annotations and sources that are not in the text itself. So that would be my real hope, that actually Zionists read it. And not that they then become anti-Zionist, but at least to know this is a very, very, very complicated story. And we're right in the middle of it.
So Shaul described Joel Teitelbaum as an incredibly sophisticated and erudite interpreter of a wide range of texts, and in fact, that is a good description of Shaul, both in this book and in the book over there, which I encourage you all to download when it comes out. Join me in thanking Shaul.
Thank you all. I really appreciate it.